Click record to the cloud. Should be recording, I'm hoping. You're sharing, stop share.
As long as it.
Yeah, I see that. Yeah, I see that the menu says now pause recording, stop recording. So I'm assuming.
Okay, yeah, then it's all good, and it's going to be in the Zoom, and I'll be able to get it afterwards.
Okay, cool. All right. I will get into it, and yeah, please feel free to interrupt me and ask questions.
We
As
will
we go.
definitely interrupt loudly and obnoxiously.
Sure, nice. So Romani or Gypsy is an Indic language, as in Hindi, Marathi, Punjabi, Gujarati, Bengali, etc., etc. So the classification, as far as the linguistics is concerned, the classification is it belongs to the Indo-European language branch of the Indo-Aryan subgroup of the Indo-Iranian languages. Within that, it's Indic, and then there's Romani. It is a language spoken outside of India by traditionally nomadic, as in traveling, groups of people whose ancestors left India about 13 to 15 centuries ago. So there's no documentation of Roma leaving India. And so it was up to linguistics, in fact, to determine that this was about 13 to 15 centuries ago. And we'll get into that a bit as well. Since the Middle Ages or so, it has been the only Indo-Aryan language spoken exclusively in Europe, right? So the other Indo-Aryan languages are spoken not in Europe, but in India, Iran, Afghanistan, and so on. And today it is spoken in the United States, South America, and the Middle East, but mostly in Europe, if you go by numbers. The name Rom or Rom, as some groups pronounce it, in most of the dialects, because there are many dialects, it means gypsy man or husband, and is the counterpart of the names used by other Indian-speaking traditionally nomadic groups. So the original caste, if you wish, name in India, and it still exists, was something like Rom. And then there are various groups. So with the Romanis, it became Rom. There are other groups in kind of Central Asia and Middle East that are called Lom and Dom, which are all derivatives from that original Rom. Okay. There is no definitive information on the number of speakers because many people do not want to participate in censuses, or the censuses just simply do not get to them. But the conservative estimate is about 3.5 million speakers in Europe and another 500,000 or so in the rest of the world, which is an appreciable number. So there's a lot.
Do we know how many of those are monolingual?
So no, sorry. So there are 3.5 million speakers of Romani.
Okay. So we don't know if they speak some other language as well, or just
monolingual in Romani only. Do you mean?
Yeah. Is that?
I see.
A prevalent thing?
Above the age of 10, 0.
Well,
got it. Thanks.
So all like you can be born in a Romani family, and up until a certain age, young age, be monolingual in Romani. Soon after that, you learn the language of the outside world. Oftentimes, so many speakers are bilingual at least, and then multilingual in many other cases. Now there are some Roma that are monolingual in other languages, as in there are some groups of Roma that have lost their language and they no longer speak it. We'll get into that a little bit in a couple of slides, I think. But yeah, most Romani speakers, by far most, the majority, unless they're little kids, are at least bilingual. So most speakers are are located in the southeastern Europe, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, Macedonia, Serbia, Montenegro, but also in Greece, Slovakia, Moldova, Hungary, and Finland, Sweden, Russia, and other places. But there are also Roma communities that are in Portugal, Spain, the UK, Finland, and more recent migrants, more recent as in the last 150 years or so, to South and North America. So like in the United States, for instance. 1 second.
I have a question. So did you ever get to spend time with any like, Romani tribes, or was your research more like academic based?
My research was academic, which involved me going into the communities and recording language from the communities. So it was, I mean, I didn't spend any prolonged period of time with any one group. Like I was never embedded in the community. So something like an anthropological research, like any serious anthropological research would probably require that, because I was, my research was limited to linguistics, to the language. I would go into the communities, I would get some interviews, very kind of structured interviews about the language, kind of focused on the grammar, more for syntaxes and so on, and then get out. So that was my experience. And my research was mostly in the Baltic states, in the Baltic nations, uh, but also Poland, Ukraine, Moldova, Russia. So right, and I would go in for a couple of weeks. I would try to find people who would be willing to share their language with me, get the interview, and then go back to my desk somewhere.
Cool.
Right. So as I mentioned before, some speakers, or some groups, in fact, this is mostly characteristic of groups, have lost their language completely, the Romani language, or to the great extent, and those are kind of groups in the western part of Europe and in the northern. So Portugal, Spain, UK, Finland, these grew, but also, yeah, there are groups elsewhere as well. They have stopped speaking Romani. They still have some sense that they are Roma, that they're different from the outside population, but they no longer speak it kind of with full inflection. They might add some words here and there in their version of Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, Hungarian, etc. But otherwise, they have lost their language. So they're, in fact, ethnically, there are more Roma than 3.5 million, but the 3.5 million refers to the number of speakers that people are actually speaking. Romani versus Gypsy. So, right. So this is, part of it is about political correctness, and part of it is about, other things that are going on. So Romani is an adjective from Rom, which, as we saw before, was like gypsy man, husband. Gypsy comes from the word Egyptian, which is a misnomer. They did not come from Egypt, but that's the origin of that exonym. Not all speakers of Romani call themselves Rom, however, or their language Romani. So there are other groups. There are some groups of the people that we're talking about here that do not call themselves Roma or their language Romani, but they would, for example, Sinti, Manouche, Calais, Romanichals, etc., etc.
But Sinti still speak the same language.
Yes, Sinti is the same language that we're talking about here. Yes. And so is Calais, and so is Manouche. Manouche is just Sinti, but on the French side of the border. Sinti is on the German-speaking side of the border. Manouche is on the French side. Calais means black in Romani, and Calais, there are groups in Portugal and Spain that call themselves Calais, and there is a group in Finland that calls themselves Kale, which is the same. So that becomes problematic. If you want to be inclusive in the term Romani, like you cannot be inclusive because that excludes some people who do not refer to themselves by that name, right? So that's one thing. And on the other hand, not all gypsies or peripatetics, right? So people who occupy the certain social niche, you know, traveling, itinerant, peripatetic, and so on. Not all of those are speakers of the Indic language. So not all of those originated in India, are descendants of these people that we're talking about. For example, there are Irish travelers. If you remember the movie Lock, Stock, and Three Smoking Barrels, for instance. So they're Celtic, they're not Indic, they're Celtic, and they speak a language they speak is called Shelta. There are various.
Snatch, actually.
Sorry?
It's Snatch. Yeah, the movie is Snatch.
Snatch.
Oh, it was from Snatch. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I got my Guy Ritchie confused. Okay. So the language that things, the language that they speak is Shelta. There are various derogatory terms for them. Tinkers is kind of more neutral, or well, I guess it is derogatory. And then pikeys, that's another one. I think that's the one that was used in the movie. There's also Yenish, which is a German-speaking in the German territories, and it's kind of a German-based argot that they speak, and they're basically Germans in this, Switzerland and so on, that are referred to something like Zigeuner in German, or gypsies, but they're not Roma, as in they're not Indic. They're not descendants of the Indic people, and the Romani is not the language that they speak. So that's what's up with the Romani versus Gypsy. It's not easy to be inclusive and politically correct at the same time, and precise at the same time to refer to that. But in my experience, the term Roma the term Roma for people is, or Roma und Sinti in the German-speaking context, is definitely used by activists, but on the ground, kind of the regular people, the majority of the population, they're completely fine with terms like Tsigani, gypsies, and so on. In scholarly work, however, the language is called Romani, and the people are called Roma, right? So that's kind of that's the tradition. Indian origin. So about 70%, and dialects vary, but on the average, about 70% of the basic vocabulary is Indic. So it would match or be very close to, Bengali or Marathi or something. For example, there are numerals, yek, dui, trin, shtar, panch, shov, shell, dash, body parts, nak, yak, kan, shero, and so on. Basic verbs, ja, go, av, come, pee, drink. I think because it's from Sanskrit, right, so all of these do come from Sanskrit, meaning that it did affect in the European languages as well. So some of these you might recognize. So dash, you might recognize, for instance, and trin, you might recognize, and something like pee, to drink, from Russian, for instance, or from Slavic languages, you would recognize. Ha, to eat, the Russian speakers among you might recognize it from Russian, from the verb havat, but that's a much later story. So that's a borrowing from Romani. That's a much more recent, last 200 years or so, 100 years, borrowing from Romani into Russian. Right, and besides the lexicon, there's also borrowings from grammar, not borrowings, there's also Indic grammar, Indic morphology that's abundant. With lack of historic documents, it took comparative linguistic analysis to place Roma ancestors in India. So there are no documents that say like, hey, these group of people characterized by such and such features left India around this year and then moved, westward, northward, and westward. So that doesn't exist. So the fact that, and by now among the scholars it's considered a fact, the fact that Roma came from India is based on linguistic analysis, right?
So we have, yeah. So we have no idea if there was like a historical event that.
Yeah, we don't
gave them a
know.
push.
There are various theories proposed, but we do not know why the ancestors of Roma would leave India and travel. It could be they were escaping wars. It could be they were looking for business. It could be that they were a gift from from a shah to a sultan. It could be all sorts of things. We do not know why, but we know approximately when, and we do know that they did come from India, and that's because of linguistics. The way it initially came about was in the late 18th century. So there was a Calvinist preacher called Stefan Wally. He was friends, back in his kind of student days, he was friends with some speakers of Sanskrit, or he was friends with students from India. And the reason they spoke Sanskrit is because the only way you could come to Europe from India at that time was if you came from high society, and high society spoke the old language, the old written language, right? So Vali was exposed to Sanskrit and he knew some. And then later, during his preaching days, he came in contact with gypsies and he realized that there are similarities. And so he made it known. And soon after that, a German linguist called Johannes Rüdiger, he first kind of actually tried to apply science to it and kind of prove the connection. So that's when the world discovered, or the researchers, linguists, whatever, discovered that Roma came from India. And here's some slides, right? So this is about the timeline and how linguistics places Roma in India during that timeline. Because while Romani is not documented, some other or most other Indic languages are documented, right? So people were writing and there are documents. And so it's known when language changed. So what does this slide show? What does this map show? So in the middle of this map is India, and we have central India and the peripheries of India. So the Sanskrit term for the verb to hear is something like shardan. And then, like soon after 500 BC, this like in the region of central India, that shardan becomes shun. So the consonant r becomes a vowel u. And it only happens in the central India. It doesn't happen in the peripheries. So somewhere it's shan, and somewhere it's shrin. And Romani does participate in the in the central Indian change, right? So in Romani, the verb to hear is shun, shunau, meaning that ancestors of Roma, or at least linguistic ancestors of Roma, were living in central India around 500 BC and sometime after. And I have a couple of other slides that, shun is not the only lexeme, not the only word that shows it. So Akshi, I became Akhi, and Achhi, it remained Achhi elsewhere. If I'm not mistaken, the Russian word Ochi comes from here, is related, well, not comes, but it is related to the Achhi as well. And then some morphology as well. So this is the same kind of, the same kind of an idea. So ancestors, linguistic ancestors of Roma were in central India around 500 BC. But around 100 BC, there are some other changes going on around India. And the Roma participate in the northern Indian. So in the changes that took place in northern India. So here you have a couple of words, patra and mrshta. And so in Romani, they become patra, they remain patra and mishta for good. But while in central India, the words change. So around 100 BC or so, they're in the northern India. So there's a movement that started at that point. Once again, we do not know why, but linguistics tells us approximately when and how how we know this. And then we come to the Byzantine Greek period, because there is a lot of borrowings, a lot of the material, linguistic material of the Romani language, regardless of the dialect. So it affects all of the dialects, comes from the Byzantine Greek. And there we already have some sources, some documents, and which I have listed some of them here. So in about, in the 800s, Saint Athanasia fed strangers near Thrace, Greece, now, which were referred to as Atsiganoi, right? So the Russian word Tsigan comes from there. Around the same time, Theophanes the Confessor wrote to the Byzantine Emperor Nicephorus I that in suppressing a revolt, he had received help from Atsiganoi, who knew magic. And a bit later, we have some other documents from Emperor Constantinus IX, which also shows that they're there. So contact with Byzantine Greek changed Romani dramatically from the Indic language that it was. There's strong impact of Greek and Romani that shows across all of the dialects. For example, some of the other numerals like Efta, Ochto, Enya, sorry, Efta, Ochto, Enya, 7, 8, 9, they come from the Byzantine Greek. Some lexicon like Drom wrote, Kokolo, but many others. So Drom you actually might recognize because it did make it to some European languages in words like Ipadrom, Ipadrom, in words like Velodrome, and so on and so forth. If any of you watched the movie Lachodrome by the French director, that's a movie about gypsies. So Lachodrome in Romani means bon voyage, right? Good path, good road, bon voyage. So that's the drum. But also, so Byzantine Greek had influence not only on the lexicon, not only on the words, but also on the morphology and the syntax of Romani. So there are nominative endings. Like in many dialects, if you borrow the word from the outside language, like president, so president will be presidentos, and that os is the Greek word, or slugas from the Slavic sluga. Slugas, that as is Greek for slave, and etc. In the verb morphology as well, and in the syntactic typology. So under the influence of Greek, Romani obtained an preposed article, definite article. So like before they didn't. So like the president or the slave or whatever. The word order changed a bit, and then whatever, this is a technical detail, but a split between factual, non-factual complementation. Something like I want to go versus I know that you did this. The complementizer that's used is different. And that's the kind of the Greek, the Byzantine Greek, and further the Balkan kind of thing. So in the languages of the Balkans, that's done. In addition to that, Romani, all of the Romani dialects at some point were influenced by Iranian and Armenian. Contact with these languages might have happened at the same time during the Byzantine time because there were speakers of Iranian and Armenian there, or it might have happened prior to that. We do not know. Starting from around 14th century, Romani speakers started spreading throughout Europe. So you find them in Germany, in England already, I think 15th century, I think in England already. So that far north. And certainly kind of the southern central Europe. Migration paths of different Roma groups can be reconstructed to some degree by layers of borrowing. So if you can imagine different groups traveling, whatever path they took, if you imagine a map, they go like north, south, east, west, and whatever they go, and they find themselves in different states and spend any appreciable amount of time there. Right now, in their dialect, whatever they speak, you can find traces of that. So linguistics is good for tracing the paths of various groups, migration paths. For example, Russian Romani, which is a certain dialect of Romani spoken in Russia. There are various dialects of Romani spoken in Russia, but this particular one, they're called Russian or North Russian Romani dialect. It has older loans from German and Polish, right? So we know that this is the path that they took. that didn't come from south, they came from the west. Complexity. Just in case anybody was thinking that Romani is a simple language, or it's an argot, or it's not a real language, here's my argument, some argument for complexity. So it has 8 cases, which are presented here. Nominative, accusative, dative, locative, instrumental. I think genitive, I think many of you might be familiar with. Ablative is kind of coming from, right? So I took it from you, or he came from England, is that kind of case. And there is vocative, which some of you might still be familiar with, but Russian lost it, some other Slavic languages haven't. Is when you call somebody, hey, you. So that's the vocative case. And they take different forms. So each noun will take these 8 times 2. The 2 is because it's singular and plurative forms. There's 5 distinct grammatical verb tenses, kind of present, past, future, imperfect, and pluperfect, or counterfactual, that are used. So there is some complexity there. And these are also, these do conjugate by person, right? So there's a first person singular, second person singular, like I do, you do, he, she does, and so on, and the plurals. Romani, most dialects at least, have a distinct negator for imperative versus subjunctive. So if you like, the second one, the first one is nahav, which means I do not eat, men nahav. But if you're trying to prevent somebody from eating, you say ma have, so don't eat. So the imperative is different. There is a complex 4-way distinction in demonstratives based on proximity. So proximity we're used to, right? This versus that. Demonstrative, that's what demonstratives are. This versus that. So we're used to this versus that. But Romani also has another axis for this, which is about plain versus specific. So this versus, this one right here. You can imagine it, this can be used for like, I saw a man yesterday. This man was in a hurry, right? So that's kind of a general this versus like, give me this book. Which one? Oh, well, this one right here, right? And so there are different forms for that. It's actually part of the grammar. There's grammatical distinction between animate versus inanimate. There's also distinction between some lexemes, between gypsy versus non-gypsy. So Rom, as we saw, is a gypsy man versus Gajo is a non-gypsy man. Same thing with a woman, Romni versus Gaji. And for the younger generation, Chavo, boy, a gypsy boy versus Raklo, which is a non-gypsy boy, and Chai versus Rakli for the girl. Okay. Why is Romani special? I'm going to try to put an argument. So Romani is preserved still as a diaspora language for the past 13, 15 centuries, which is more than you can say for most other diaspora contexts, right? So if somebody like, what is Italian American, right? Italian American is somebody who came 2, 3, 4 generations maybe ago. Within 2 generations, maybe 3, the language is lost, and that's the norm. That's what happens usually. So Romani, being in diaspora and not having a state at all, has sustained its language and its culture, but the language is a big part of culture, or a big marker of culture or identity, for many, many, many generations, which is weird, right? It's strange. It's idiosyncratic. I guess another cool thing about Romani is because it's not a written language, and because it's not used in any institutions like courts or law or school or whatever. There's no distinction between speech registers. So something like, like there's no difference, there's no need for a difference between words like penis versus dick versus wee wee for, for little kids. It's just one word. There are many varieties of Romani, many dialects, which is valuable in general for the study of dialectological variation. And Romani is in contact with many other languages, which is cool for studying language contact. So here I'm showing some of the dialectology that people work on, including myself. So this one shows that there's a geographical dimension to to variation between the language. So kind of to the north of those lines, kind of those squigglies in linguistics or in general in culture studies, they're called isoglosses. So on the north of those squigglies, people say these forms, but to the south of those squigglies, people say something else, right? So there's a whole bunch of words or a whole bunch of forms that are different, right? So there's the variation, and that those squigglies correspond more or less to the border of the Ottoman Empire when it existed. So there was a big divide, the border of the Ottoman Empire, which couldn't easily be crossed. The time passed, and so people on the north, in the north, started, their language changed in some way, and people in the south, their language changed in some other way, and so we have the geographical dimension to the variation. This one shows the kind of genealogical dimension of variation. Genealogical variation is, I guess, we're used to it from the kind of the tree analogy, right? So kind of the language tree family, right? So the Slavics, the Russian is part of Slavic, and Slavic and Baltic is part of Baltic Slavic, and that's part of Indo-European, and so on. Romance languages, so kind of there's a proto-language, and then it splits into the various other languages within the branch. So there is some truth to that. I don't know if you can see these things, but this map shows kind of in the center. It shows the Baltics. Can you see my cursor, by the way?
Yep.
Okay. So if you look at like all of the triangles are blue, and all of the squares are red, even in cases where they cross the border, right? So the squares are red in Latvia, in Estonia, in Russia, in Poland. So no matter where this particular group of Roma lives, they
Anton, sorry, my geography is horrible.
Yeah.
Can you just kind of point and name those areas, maybe?
Estonia. Yeah, this is Estonia. This is Lithuania. Sorry, this is Latvia. This is Lithuania. This is Belarus, and this is Russia, and this is Poland. So squares correspond to a certain type of dialect. It's a Haladitka type of dialect. It's a dialect spoken mostly in Russia, but also in other places. So, so speakers of the Haladitka dialect, the squares, they're all red. They all use the word dives for day. But speakers of the Latvitka dialect, the one that's mostly centered in Latvia, they use the form dies, regardless of whether they are in Latvia or Estonia or Lithuania. So kind of this genealogical, this idea of, okay, I'm a speaker of such and such a dialect, such and such a variety. And even if I live among other Roma which speak something else, I will retain my own kind of, my own specifics of the language. Language contact is, so Romani is great for studying language contact in general because it's in contact with so many other languages. And you can, for instance, Romani has been used to kind of support the borrowing hierarchies that were proposed. Borrowing hierarchies is like something is more prone to being borrowed than something else. Or put another way, if something is borrowed, then something else is, by implication, something else is borrowed. So plural forms morphology is more prone to borrowing than singular that came from Romani. Conjunctions hierarchy, and is borrowed less than or, which is borrowed less than but. So no Romani dialects, I think, has the original word for but. Maybe, I don't know, 20% of Romani dialects have the original word for or, and something like 80% of the dialects have the original word for and. So
so they're mostly very agreeable people. They all have a word for and,
that
but
would
not
be
so much for but.
that would be the Roma have been known to be pacifists, right? But this is this is about this however is about grammar. So this is just how language change works. Nouns are more prone to borrowing than verbs. Sorry, the other way. Verbs are more, nouns are more prone to borrowing than verbs. Lexical words are more prone to be borrowed than function words. And then sentence structure is even more salient. And now the language context in reverse. So this is cases where Romany not when Romany borrows from the outside languages, but where other outside languages borrow from Romany. And I just put English and Russian there because that seems like the most relevant. So the word pal in English comes from pal, brother. The word lollipop comes from lollipop or pabai, which means red apple. Shiv, or shiv rather, and I'm not sure, this is a slang term, so I'm not sure if all of you have heard it, but it's a slang word for knife or to knife somebody, comes from chief, to cut. And if you're in the kind of central or northern England, at least, I don't think this word has made it here, but a word like chav, which is basically a male, mostly member of a proletariat group, a young hoodlum, is a chav. So that comes from the Romani chavo, for gypsy boy. And for the Russian ones, so I mentioned already habak. It comes from the verb ha. There's also laja, comes from laj, which means shame. Lave is just a direct borrowing, it just means Romani. Sorry, it just means money in Romani. And minjvatsa comes from minj, which means vagina cunt, however you want to put it. If you go into, I've studied this a bit more. So if you go into more specialized jargons in Russian, which is what I studied, kind of thieves jargons or the kind of penitentiaries jargons, then you will find much more Romani words, and Yiddish as well, of course, which are not known to the general public, but they are part of the kind of more specialized jargon. And those are all of my slides.
That's awesome. I have to say, I'm really surprised by some of the borrowings. I would have never imagined.
Right. Well, I mean, minority languages are a good candidate for borrowing. I mean, we kind of know this about Yiddish, right? So Yiddish, most of us probably do know that there is a bunch of Yiddish in English and Russian, as far as slang terms are concerned and so on. Yeah. And so Romani as well.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
So let's open this up. Well, let's give people a minute to maybe get more drinks, and then let's open it up for questions.
So I have a question. Is considering how ancient this language is, what have there been any successful or unsuccessful attempts to develop writing? And is it, to what extent is it a written language, a literary language?
Sure. Okay, a couple of things. I guess from Mike, come from the kind of functional linguist tradition. So as far as a functional linguist is concerned, as opposed to formal linguist. So as far as a functional linguist is concerned, no language is more ancient than others. They all, they all develop and live at the same time. It's very hard to say like my lineage is older than your lineage because, well, we're here. We all had grandmas and great grandmas and so on, and the genes moved, and just the same, very similarly, kind of the language changes move. So from that point of view, no live language is any older or more ancient than other languages, but that's a peripheral thing. It's not written traditionally in the past 50 years. Well, okay. so far the biggest attempt to make Romani a kind of a written language, a literary language, has come surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, from the Soviet Union. In the late 20s, there was a policy towards minority peoples, not only gypsies, but all minority peoples, uh, to kind of, under the agenda of all peoples are brothers. There was a short period of time from kind of like mid 20s to early 30s where a lot of money and resources were put by the Soviets into studying various languages and areas and various ethnicities. And Romani was not an exception. So at that time, some magazines, kind of regular periodics came out, some publication of some 60, I want to say, or so books. Some of them were translations. For example, there is a book of translations by Pushkin into Romani, right? That came out. Some of them were like brochures about hygiene, right? About like how you should wash up or like how you should wash your hands. Some were the general uh, ligbez, so like a general kind of educational thing. Things like there was a book about elephants, right, in Romani, and so on. So that was the biggest push. And then like by 33, 34, that all died. I mean, the policy of the Soviet Union towards the minority ethnicities changed. And instead of being brothers, they were still brothers, but they were supposed to be brothers that should abandon their ways and their language and switch to Russian as the big brother language. So that kind of stopped, but that did exist in history. More recently, yeah, there are chat rooms, there are books being published. There is no standard because there is no state, right? So a standard language or standard writing system can only exist if there's a state to enforce it, right? If you go to school and somebody is gonna, give you a bad mark or like hit you over a hand, if you use some form that you're not supposed to use, or like if you write something wrongly. Um, in lieu of that, a standard cannot exist. So a pluralistic writing system exists. Everybody writes their dialect the way that they want, and it's pretty transparent, as in it's easy to understand. I don't know if some of you understand, like myself, are immigrants. Um, with a Russian speaking background. So I don't know if when you immigrated, I immigrated during the time when soon after I immigrated, the internet appeared, but the Cyrillic on the computer still wasn't there. So people used Translate, so used the English or the Roman alphabet, the English Roman alphabet, to write whatever Russian they needed to write, and nobody had a single problem understanding what people are writing. And the systems were different. Some people would use six, шестерка for sh, for instance, and four, четверка for ch. Some people used sh and ch. Some people used all sorts of things, but nobody. And so that kind of a pluralism existed for a bit until the kind of the Cyrillic alphabet came to the drivers were built for it. So that's the kind of system that you might want to imagine, right? So it's a pluralism, and nobody gives a shit about nobody gives a shit about the standard. There is no standard because it cannot be. There is no state to enforce it, and nobody really cares, except for some activists. And in the late 70s, early 80s, there was an attempt to make a kind of single unified Romani alphabet, which failed. Pragmatically, it failed. I mean, it still exists, and there are still some publications in Romani that use it. It's very cumbersome, very complex. There are some weird characters that are used for it, and so it did not, apart from some activists and some very particular publications, nobody is using it. There are message boards, there are emails, there are Facebook groups where people write Romani in whatever Cyrillic, Arabic, probably. I haven't encountered, but probably. various versions of the Roman alphabet, whether they're in Hungary or in Romania or in the United States and so on.
So thank you for explaining that. And on the flip side of it, since it seems like it's mostly an oral tradition, is there some sort of an epos that the gypsy have produced? Like, you know what I mean? Same as Gilgamesh or whatever.
Not that I know of, at least. And I haven't studied Romani literature or Romani spoken, I don't know, folklore, I guess, tradition, as much as some other people, I'm sure. But as far as I know, no, there is no epos, but there are recurrent themes in Romani stories or Romani songs. Or there is a tradition of spoken stories, right? So there are people, I think this still exists, it's a dying tradition of people who kind of are good at telling stories, right? And they have a whole bunch of stories in their arsenal and they tell them well. So there are some patterns or there are some recurring themes. One of them has to do with the dead. So there's definitely a cult of the dead and the fear of the dead. So like if dead come in a dream, that's bad, or like dead come and like they'll, basically the what was it cartoon? The Corpse Bride, was it? Was that a thing? Corpse Bride? I don't know if any of you have seen Corpse Bride. This is basically
Yes,
Romany.
yes, it was.
Yeah, so that's basically a very, very Romany thing. The story is, I forget which one is which, but the story is, there's a young man who is living his life and he's dreaming of love, and all of a sudden he meets a perfectly nice young woman who he falls in love with, and she falls in love with him, and then it turns out that she's really a corpse. She's really dead, and she brings him down to the land of the dead, and that's a scary thing. That's and it's up to the rest of the community, his brothers, his, I don't know, mother, whatever, to kind of to take him out of from the land of the dead or not, or maybe the parish is there. So those kind of like those spins on that story come up a lot. That's definitely a Romani thing. So cult of the dead, cult and fear of the dead.
Okay, I have a question. So I don't actually know very much about Roma culture, but there's obviously all these stereotypes and all these ideas about, like magic and kind of, I don't know, more
Fortune telling,
sort of more mystical ways of interacting with reality. And so I'm wondering, first of all, is that reflected in the language in any way? And also I'm wondering, in addition to taking the language with them, in what way did they take culture with them? Is there anything left over from, their Indian roots or whatever they picked up along the way?
That's a good question. Once again, I'm a linguist, I'm not an anthropologist, so I'll probably know less than some of, other people who actually devoted their time doing this. But the word for God is Devel in Romani, and that's an Indic word. I don't think it's related to devil, but it's it's related to the divine. It is related to divine, right? So from Sanskrit, via Indo-European to like kind of divine, and from Sanskrit through Indic to Romani devel. That's so the word for God is there. As far as other words, I'm not sure how much they took. I mean, the various idiosyncrasies about kind of the cult of the dead, the ideas about ritual purity are there, and those likely came from India because they did not come from any surrounding populations. So, and ritual purity, like it's a complex subject, but like a very simple thing, like I was living with a family for, I don't know, for several days, and they had a separate, there needed to be separate towels and separate kind of water basins for washing hands versus washing face versus washing feet, right? And that has to do with ritual purity. Um, Among some Roma, and this is a newer thing, the manifestation of this ritual purity that I'm going to mention right now is new, but the ritual purity itself as an idea is old. So among Finnish Roma, if a woman, and basically anything below a woman's waist is ritually unclean, right? That means that they cannot live in two-story houses, or if they do, only men can go up, right? So a woman cannot go up to the second floor because otherwise everything underneath her becomes dirty. It becomes interesting, like when they go to the mall and use an escalator, for instance, right? That becomes interesting because there is a very strict order of who goes first. So if, going up, a man has to go first. Going down, a woman has to go first, right? So like there should never be a moment where a man or anybody is underneath a woman because of this ritual purity thing. This is obviously ritual. There's nothing, there's nothing pragmatic about it.
So woman on top is not an option?
Not in that color. Yeah, I'm sorry. Like I don't know I don't know what your plans were, but probably not if you want to join the Finnish Roma. This right. So this idiosyncrasy that I mentioned is particular to the Finnish gypsies.
So you mentioned that Finnish gypsies do not speak Roma, yet presumably they still live as a community, and I'm just wondering, like, is there a difference? Is the community more short-lived? Does it assimilate more as a result of being a non-Roma speaking community, and presumably do they have their own dialect of Finnish? So what's the story there?
Yep, very, very good question. There are several things. So as far, they do insert some Finnish, some Romani words into their Finnish. So you still would have, if you're a Finn riding on the bus with some Finnish Roma, you would still have a bit of a hard time, or mostly a hard time understanding what they're saying if they wished. So they can still insert, I don't know, maybe like something like 200 lexemes that they can insert into their Finnish that will obscure the meaning, because these are basic words and basic verbs specifically, but they do not, there's no grammar, the grammar is lost. So you would still not understand it. Right, so one reason why Finnish Roma and Scandinavian Roma specifically lost their language is because of the state policies toward Roma after World War II specifically. So in Finland and in Sweden and in Norway, there were politics of sterilization. So they would sterilize women and send kids to the orphanages, basically. Not there's a better word, kind of like like children's homes, basically, right? So they would, the states would send kids to children's homes and would forcibly sterilize women, and so that would destroy your community and your language, and that's what happened there. So that's another thing to remember. Interestingly enough, so I mentioned this very weird idiosyncrasy, kind of this very, very, very awkward conservative thing, or very, very awkward conservative manifestation of this ritual cleanliness thing that happens with Finnish Roma. And I think that is part of their compensation for losing the language. So what happens in that case, and in other cases probably as well, is as you lose a very important marker of your identity, which language for Roma certainly is, because they kept it for 15 centuries, let's say. If you lose that, then you need to overcompensate for that. You need to become even more weird than the outside population. And in fact, so Finnish Roma, they dress very, very, I don't know, if you Google at some point later, Finnish Roma, you would see people dress very, very strangely. Not like Finns do at all, not like anybody does. There are very, very cumbersome skirts for women that are very heavy, and it's a kind of, there's a supportive structure that goes there. So a woman can actually kind of like plump herself down on the sidewalk, and the skirt structure will hold her. She will actually sit there. And men dress kind of, idiosyncratically as well. So as you lose one marker of identity, you want to overcompensate, and Finnish Roma did that by becoming extra conservative, extra weird, extra idiosyncratic. I hope that.
I have a somewhat silly question. I noticed a couple of similarities in words when you gave examples. In particular, when there are different words for like a gypsy man and a non-gypsy man, the word for a non-gypsy man was
Gajo.
yeah. It doesn't sound that way, but the way you wrote it, it looked very similar to a Japanese word gaijin,
It's a pure currency.
which is a non-Japanese.
Right. Right, and that's an interesting coincidence. It's fun to think about it, but it is a coincidence.
Okay.
It is a coincidence.
Alright.
I don't remember off the top of my head the etymology of the Romani word gajo. I'm not sure where it came from, but it's an Indic word, and is not related to the Japanese word for.
And another one, which is probably a coincidence as well, I just want to kind of confirm that it probably is that when you just started your talk, you said that one of the things that brought you to the culture is that there is a certain amount of romanticism. Is there any relation between the word romantic and the word Roma?
No, I think the word romantic is related to the word romance, as in Romance languages, and that is related to
Yeah.
Rome, the city, and the Roman Empire.
Okay.
I mean, it's kind of interesting that like it's a Roma language, but it's not in a Romance family of languages.
No, and the word Rom comes from a certain caste of service providers in India, which is still used, and the word is Rom.
Mhm.
Caste of sorry, what do you mean by caste of service providers?
India has a caste system, so
Oh, caste. Okay.
sorry. There is a caste system, and caste system is very complex. So it's not only it's not
Right. No, I missed that. Yeah. I misunderstood the first word that you said.
Right. So there's a certain type of, I think it's in Rajasthan, a certain type of people that do this sort of thing, and the word still exists. I mean, there are all sorts of names, and there are many groups of people, castes, if you want. And so one of them still exists, and it's called Rom. Sorry, I'm not. It's a retroflex, so your tongue is doing that. Rom, and from there came Rom, and came Lom in Central Asia, and Dom in the Middle East, because there are other groups besides Roma that came from there. Lom and Dom are.
So is the assumption is that members of this particular caste were the ones that like wandered off?
Yes,
And
that's
that
the
would be
assumption. There's no proof, of course, but there is a strong assumption that yes, they were called Rom. As they migrated, they still retained the ethnonym, like as we are Rom, it became Rom, Lom, Dom in some other places. So yeah, a coincidence once again. Romance is from Rome, and Rome is from the caste.
I have one more question on the subject of songs, of gypsy songs. I mean, all of I mean, I think that if for most of us, songs are the only thing that we sort of know about gypsy culture, and a lot, and very often it's in languages like Russian or Spanish that we hear these songs, and maybe they all exist only in those languages, but I'm wondering whether, actually, a couple of questions. So the first one is, do those lyrical tropes that we think of as gypsy ornaments in Russian language gypsy songs, you know, da еще раз, да еще много раз, and all that kind of stuff. Does that have like, is that actually rooted in something or anything in Roma language? And the second is very specific. You know, I think I suspect I'm not the only one who's a big fan of Bregovich's music for Kusturica, for Kusturica's movies, and you know, Time of the Gypsies in particular, and Ederlezi in particular. So I'm wondering whether that song is actually an example of, is that being sung in Roma, and in general, you know, how much of the Gypsy songs that, you know, are in Roma versus other languages.
Once again, not a musicologist, but I mean, I know a little bit. Sorry, which specific song were you talking about?
Well, so there's a song that has a lot of different versions called Ederlezi.
Oh, Ederlezi, yeah.
Yeah, which is like a Turkish. Pardon?
Ederlezi is a Turkish name for St. George's Day.
Right. Yes. Exactly. So.
And Gypsies celebrate it, and right.
But so, what about Russian? What about what we in Russian think of as Gypsy songs? I mean, are they rooted in Roma in any way?
Right. Okay. I think I have a good, maybe general way to address this. So, these are hybrids. So in Russian, this is a hybrid of whatever Romani musical culture was, I guess, in Russian. In Spanish, the flamenco is, you know, whatever the Spaniards had, you know, mixed with Russian. In the Balkans, including Turkey, it's the, you know, well, in Romania, like in Hungary, like the Cerdash, plus the whatever Gypsies have. In Turkish music is the Turkish music, and so on. So my general way to answer this is musical affinity is malleable, as in it switches. Similarly to religious affiliation. So there are Roma who are of all sorts of confession. You know, there's Russian Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox in Russia. There's Catholics throughout the Central Europe, you know, Roma Catholics. There's Muslims in the Muslim parts of the Balkans and Turkey and so on. There is plenty of Pentecostals kind of in the last 50 or so years throughout the world and so on. So religion changes easily, and it seems like the musical or musical tradition, you wouldn't call it a tradition, but kind of musical output changes fairly easily as well. But I think it is a mix. So Roma do seem to add some to the Spanish music to come up with flamenco, to the Russian music to come up with the Russian Romance song or the Gypsy Romance song. And in the Balkans, you know, to add to the Balkan music, which they do. And I think the reason that the music changes is because music was a way, and still is for many groups or some families, a way to make a living, and so you cater to whoever is paying the bill. So being a professional musician, you cater to those who pay the bill, and so you adapt whatever the outside has to offer, maybe mix it with your own something to have some originality, and then you and then you perform it because it's a way to make a living. Because I mean, entertainment is one of the traditional professions that Roma had and still have. Among others, there are other traditional professions. I think that's my general answer for this. Russian Romance song, yeah, the Russian Romance songs. They're Gypsy. The way that the Russian Gypsies sing their songs oftentimes is similar to their Gypsy Romance or Russian Romance songs that you would know, but that happened late, like that happened throughout the age, because there's been like 300 years at least or so to kind of adapt. I hope that answers it.
Yep, thanks.
Hi, I have a particular question about one of your examples.
Okay.
So you said that Gypsy doesn't have register, as in profane versus literary and so on. And then you gave some examples from Russian, with one of them being Minzhevatsa. So the source word for that, is that neutral in Romani? Because
Yeah,
you translated it as cunt, but is it?
right. It could have been vagina just as well, or female sex organ, or.
Okay, so, okay, got it. So it's potentially not as offensive as it might be
Right.
considered. Okay.
I thought it was a fun way to end my slides. That's word.
It was, absolutely.
Yeah, but it is neutral, as in, there's no kind of like child or like childish register, not much at least, versus normal versus kind of official or high level register or literary register that doesn't come into it.
What is the, I guess, kind of following up on the same thought, what is the volume, like language volume? Is it, more sparse than some other languages out there?
That's a good question. That depends. I mean, because wherever Roma live, as I mentioned, they're at least bilingual. The adults are, and so anything from the outside language, which they know perfectly well, is potentially subject to borrowing, including instantaneous borrowing. And so once the word is borrowed, like how do you count it as an, for example, if we take Russian gypsies, right? And they're speaking to each other, and then they borrow a Russian word right into their speech. And they adapt it with the Romani kind of ending, and with the Romani morphology and so on. They adapt it, but once that's done, is that a Romani word or is that still a Russian word? And so if that is counted as a Romani word, then yes, it's huge, because anything is, it's just as big as Russian, because in that case, because anything can be borrowed. But yeah, the original the original Indic plus the borrowed Greek is something like 1,000 lexemes, which is not that much. 1,000 lexemes plus, plus you can add derivations to it, like diminutives. For adjectives, you can do the normal form versus superlative, good, better, well, good, better, best, and that kind of thing. So that kind of adds more, but it's about 1,000 lexemes or so, which is not much. But the rest is borrowed. So functionally, anything that needs to be expressed can be expressed, because the outside language is always at the speaker's disposal. Which makes it fun for we're like in situations where Roma from different countries meet, they need to like curb the borrowing in order to come up with a kind of the original content. And of course, it's been such a long time that many and the migration paths, so for Russian Roma, they have German words, they have Polish words, and there's been many generations. So the speakers do not realize often that these are Polish words or German words. So in trying to curb that, like it's not always obvious which one is a borrowing and which one is not. So that makes for fun interactions when Roma from different places meet.
It's like when Russians from the States meet Russians from Israel. Sometimes you can't make out what they're saying.
Yes, and now 300 years ahead.
Exactly.
500 years ahead, and both groups have kept their language. They're Russian. So that's what we're talking about. And at some point, Right, and the ones that are from the States, they actually like travel through France and picked up some French there, and now they do not even know that it's French. Like, yeah, that's yeah, but that's the direction. I'm happy to entertain more questions of any sort.
Uh, yeah, you said a few times that you were a linguist rather than an anthropologist or anything like that, but I still kind of wonder, maybe you know. Like you said that, as far as you know, there is no like single mythos that is associated with the gypsy culture, but still, I kind of have to wonder, like, say if you were a little gypsy kid and your mom is tucking you into bed, what kind of fairy tale would she tell you?
I was never a little gypsy kid. So I don't have any. I don't have any first-hand experience with it, of course, but I don't know. I read some. I read some Romani, gypsy Romani, whatever folklore tales, and so well, the cult of the dead I already spoke about, and kind of the fear of the dead. That's a trope. Um, various stories of trickery. That's definitely part of it. As a I'm trying to remember.
I assume that like that tricking people is good.
Yes, tricking people is good. Yeah, tricking outsiders is good. I mean, the trickery. So like within those tales, the trickery can be against a devil, or it can be against a greedy farmer, or just a generally an outsider. So there is definitely, we're off the subject of folklore for, I guess, a bit now, but it is an interesting topic. So there is a, as I mentioned, even linguistically, there is a divide between us versus them. It's very important who is a gypsy, who is not gypsy, and with that comes an understanding that tricking outsiders is okay. Not always. I mean, many, like, I do not want to misrepresent people. There are plenty of Roma who live their lives, just like you and I would. They work their jobs and so on. But as part of the folklore and understanding, kind of tricking others. I mean, you can imagine Jewish jokes, right? For instance, like how a Jew tricked, a Gentile, and so on. It's that sort of thing. So that is that, us versus them is definitely there, and the us versus them, it does afford, so I mentioned that there are various traditional professions, and thievery is indeed one of them. It's one of many. It's not the only one. And so there are some groups, and I've met actually, a person who is from the group, or at least his ancestors were, who their traditional profession was thieving. That's what they were doing. So that is also part of it. And I think the division of us versus them is what allows for that to happen. Kind of for that to be reconciled, to be a good person and steal from, but not from gypsies, is okay. For some groups, in some contexts, and so on, I want to really curb it, because I do not want to misrepresent people. Kind of the stereotype: old gypsies steal your babies and whatever. They'll trick you. They'll hypnotize it. That is not. I mean, there's something to it, but mostly that is not true. There are very specific groups that do that, and most do not. It's just that you don't much hear, like in the press, you don't hear about a gypsy who works in a factory. Like that just doesn't make the news. And a gypsy who like steals, like hypnotizes a woman and steals her wallet, that does make the news. So yeah, thievery, or like tricks, like trickery is, oh, I remember a good fairy tale that I like. So a gypsy goes, he needs some money, so he goes and he tries to get a job with a rich farmer, right? And the farmer says, okay, that's fine, and then go cut the grass. Go to my fields and go cut the grass. And the gypsy guy says, okay, fine, I'll cut the grass. That'll cost you 10 rubles. And the farmer says, yeah, okay, fine. And the gypsy goes to the field somewhere far away, and he like sleeps throughout the whole night. He has some drink, he has some food, he plays his guitar, He returns to the farmer and says, okay, I'm done. Give me the 10 rubles. And the farmer says, you know what? No, I decided that I will not give you 10 rubles. I'll give you 5 instead. And the gypsy guys go, okay, well then I'll make the grass grow again. Because he did not cut the grass, right? And so that's an example of an internal, that's not for external consumption, but there is a type of a story that gets circulated, gets told to kids, and kind of that kind of thing, right? So being smart, outsmarting some other people, not being out tricked by somebody, that's a value. Another one, I guess another trope I just remembered. There is a complex, especially among the various Roma groups that are Christian, not the Muslims. There are various myths about gypsies and Christ and nails on the cross. So there's a bunch of those, and with different outcomes. One of the traditional gypsy professions or Romani professions is smithery, right? So they do stuff out of metal. And so there are various versions of it, when the Romans were hanging Christ, they came to the gypsy man and asked them to make the nails for the cross, and the gypsy man says okay, and he made the nails. And that's why the gypsies are bound to be poor all the time and wander the world, because God punished them for making the nails for Christ, right? Okay, so that's one version of the story. Another version of the story is, okay, the Romans, they came to the gypsy man and said, okay, fine, I'll make the nails. But at the very last moment, he made the nails out of the material that did not, a very, very soft material that looked like nails, but they really weren't. And that's why God said, okay, gypsies, now you're allowed to go all over the world, wherever you want, and do whatever you want, right? So that, that's another version of the story. So that's those kinds of stories that have to do with Christ, smithery, nails, and kind of either and being exceptional in some way, either in a bad way or in a good way, in the eyes of God, or in the eyes of society, if you wish. Right.
Well, I don't know if anyone else has any more questions, because I feel like we should probably let Anton go. He's been on for like an hour and a half.
Yeah, I am dying for a cigarette, actually.
All right, so we'll call it a smoke break and let you go. Thank you so much for doing the talk. It's been really interesting and some really great stories there.
Thank you for hearing me out and for the questions. The questions were wonderful questions. This was nice. It was fun.
Great stuff. Thank you.
Super interesting. Thank you so much.
Of course. I should do. Wait, I should do something. I should do. Stop recording, right?
Yeah, you should stop recording.
Okay, I'm stopping recording.